Welcome to week 10 of DMD100, Intro to Digital Media Design. How's everybody doing? Okay, so let's take a look at the week 10 module. Go to week 10, go to the overview. Okay, so a couple of things this week. We are going to briefly talk about another tenet of visual literacy. This one is narrative contraction and expansion, and this is really just sort of a different way of looking at some of the seeing versus looking, the pictograms, the idea of logo development, just sort of putting it together and focused on more of a storytelling point of view. And in line with that, you have two digestibles this week, two consumables. This video here, The Magic Science of Storytelling, which talks about sort of some biological scientific background between the effectiveness of storytelling and the way in which you construct a story. So that's a great video to watch. And then this is a more mechanical, technical, practical video talking about visual storytelling 101 for filmmaking. This ties directly into our semester-long project of making a title sequence, just to give you a little background on sort of how filmmakers use certain techniques for visual storytelling. So be sure to watch both of these videos for your weekly consumable this week. The other thing we're going to go over in a minute is you have a week-long discussion board assignment, discussion board 3, called Emotional Connection and Storytelling. We're going to go over that in a second. Okay, so before we do that, let's jump into narrative contraction and expansion and just give you a quick overview of this, just something to sort of wrap your mind around. Okay, so here's our friend the apple. We have seen this apple hanging on this tree in this orchard numerous times. Now, if you remember back to week 1 or so when we were talking about the idea of seeing versus looking, we talked about how a photograph like this can prompt you to ask a lot of questions about it. Where is this orchard? How many trees are there? Who works there? What is their story? What time of day was this taken? What does the water indicate? And so on and so forth. You remember that. And then from asking all those questions, you can then attempt to answer them. And so as a result, the size of the narrative or the story that you could construct about this photograph is really big. So if you look over here on the right, this is sort of my story meter. And so you can see the size of the story related to sort of a realistic photograph like this. It can be really big. You ask a bunch of questions, you answer all those questions, and you could have an endless amount of information that could become the richer tapestry of this particular story. Now, the premise of narrative contraction and expansion is that as the visual representation of something is more rich and more large, the story, of course, is also rich and large. And as the representation of the image gets simpler, like this, the story gets smaller because there's less things you can say about it. There are less questions you can ask, right? This is a real apple, but of course it's on a fake background and it's been photoshopped. It's had some adjustments made to it to make it look kind of unreal to a certain degree. It's got a fake shadow. It's just got that one leaf and the one stem, giving it kind of that stereotypical perfect apple look. And so while it's interesting to look at, there's less visual information here and so less of a story to tell about it. Here is that drawn version of the apple. This is done in like Conti crayon or regular crayon or something like that. And so while it's a nice artistic representation of an apple, again, there's less story about it that you could tell. So the story gets a little smaller. Now when we get down to sort of an iconic or pictogram version of an apple, there's even less to say about it, right? It's just a black graphic representation of an apple made up of sort of curves and geometric shapes on a flat white background. So the visual representation of it gets simpler and therefore the story about it gets smaller as well. There's less things to talk about, less questions to ask, less things you can talk about with regard to this particular version of the apple. Now, last time around we talked about pictograms and icons becoming logos or the basis for logos. And so logos, of course, are even more simplified versions of an object or a visual representation. But because they become logos and they are attached to a company or a brand, then something interesting happens in that the visual representation of that object, our apple, the story goes back to being a big story, because now we have a very simplified version of an apple, but this also happens to be the logo for Apple Computer Company. So even though it has gone down to probably its most visually simplest form, because it's attached to this larger company, this larger organization, now the story gets huge, because you might have an experience with Apple, you might know who they are, you can look into their history as a company, you can look into the people who started the company, who worked there, what they've done over the years. And so from all of those inquiries and all of those questions, the story as related to this very simplified version of an apple gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And so you can see my story meter on the right goes right back up again, right? So that is really the only concept of story contraction and expansion, is that while the rule of thumb is that the simpler the visual representation, the smaller the story, that changes when that visual representation becomes very recognizable, whether it be a logo or if it's recognizable for other reasons. So something to pay attention to when you are using visual representations of objects, right? If it's reminiscent of something that's well known, if it is something that's well known, and you want to use it in a very small and specific way, be careful of what the story is behind it. Just think about, does this mean something else to somebody? So if somebody were to use this graphical representation of an apple, not knowing that it was Apple's logo, for example, let's say they were unaware of that, everybody else who sees it, your audience, the people who are going to see the thing that you used it in, the piece of artwork or the project or whatever, they're going to say, hey, wait a minute, isn't that the Apple logo? And then they're going to bring all of those associations with them to the conversation. Now, this is a really, specific, obvious example. And of course, we've been using apples as our demonstrative tools through the whole semester, but there are other areas where this happens too. So anyway, that is story contraction and expansion, something to think about. Okay, next, your week-long assignments. The only thing that's really due this week, you can see here under due, nothing is actually due this week except for the discussion board. So be sure to spend a good chunk of time this week working on this. Let's take a look at discussion board 3. So this is called Emotional Connection and Storytelling. So here are some bulleted, simplified explanations of sort of storytelling snapshots from history. Some of these you might be familiar with from either literature classes or history classes, and some of them might be new to you. So the oral tradition is the first one. Oral tradition, of course, dates back to early man, right? Early humans, long before there was a written word, and back around the time that pictograms and pictographs were being carved or scrawled onto cave walls. The old tradition, of course, refers to the lore of cultures. It is stories that are transmitted by word of mouth, of both prose and verse narratives, poems, songs, myths, dramas. It's basically how groups of people passed along information to other groups of people for a long time. And of course, the oral tradition continues today, even though we have written language and we have lots of other ways to communicate. The oral tradition continues today. The next idea is person perception. Person perception is a psychological process. It's a mental process that we use to form impressions of other people. We take very subjective experiences that we have and we apply them to people based on expectations, which are almost solely based on how they look and how they are acting at the moment that you first meet them. Basically, first impressions is a more colloquial way to say this. So a shirt that somebody's wearing might give you a clue as to who they are. The colors of their clothing, the way in which they walk, their hair color, the way, whether or not they have facial hair or not. All of these things give you clues as to what they're all about, understanding that all of these clues are based on your past experiences with similar things, which does not mean they necessarily apply to that person, but it is a quick and easy way to sort of come up with a brief overview of what they might be about. Understanding, of course, that you could be wrong. The rest of the story, this was part of a radio show that was on the air for a long time, which revolves around understanding the value of personal perception as it relates to the events in our lives, meaning that you could have two people who were at the exact same event, 10, 15 years ago, and even though the facts of that event are exactly the same for each person, the way they experienced that event could be vastly different. So maybe, you know, somebody in your family had to go to the hospital a long time ago, and maybe you were involved in it as a little kid, and maybe your parent was involved in it as an adult. And even though you both experienced it at the same time and the facts are the same, you might have two completely different stories to tell, right? You could say, oh, I remember when my aunt had to get rushed to the hospital, and you have one take on the story, and then maybe your parent who was there might have a completely different take on the story. You could attend the same get-together, you could be in the same place. Even two people who go to the same concert could experience it completely differently. So the rest of the story is really the understanding that the facts of a particular story are completely seen differently based on the circumstances and the perception of the people who interacted with them. The importance of imagination. There have been studies about why imagination is important to the mental development of people. It helps the ability to form new images and sensations in the mind that are not perceived through senses, such as sight, hearing, and other senses. It actually involves critical thinking to a certain degree. It helps make knowledge applicable in solving problems and is fundamental in integrating experience and the learning process. And of course, listening to storytelling. This is why people read to their children, or you listen to story time, or you hear stories or do some reading when you were a child. This is sort of like basic training for imagination. Somebody reads a book to you and you can imagine the story in your head, right? Okay, next, putting it together. This is based on the work of Swiss psychologist and philosopher Jean Piaget. He posited that perceptions depend on the worldview of the person who has the perception. The worldview is the result of arranging perceptions into existing imagery by use of imagination, so this ties in imagination nicely. Piaget always cited the example of a child saying that, the moon is following her when she walks around the village at night, and we all see things like this. In fact, in common conversation, we say this all the time. We'll say, oh, look, the sun is rising, or the sun is setting. But that's a fiction, right? That's a narrative that we all sort of subscribe to. The sun doesn't rise or fall. The earth rotates away from it or towards it. So we know the scientific reason why these things happen. We learn those in school. There's a mechanics to it. And yet we continue to say things like, oh, look, the sun is rising. The sun is not actually rising. But there is something about that story that makes sense to us. George Lucas, the creator of Star Wars, has a great quote on storytelling that I included here. He said that, remember that the real audience for all stories and all myths is the kids that are coming of age. There is a age group somewhere between 6 and 12, 13 years old where we are sort of at our most impressionable, meaning that the stories and the imagery and what we read, that we come into contact in that age group, are the things that will stick with us the longest in life and that will help sort of shape who we are as adults. And that's really an important thing to sort of remember. Okay, so these are just sort of like little snippets of different advice, different histories, different theories on storytelling. So keep those in mind, and then the discussion for the week is that you are going to use those to help explain a story that you're going to tell. So you're going to think of a story from when you were a kid or from when you were young, sort of in that age group that George Lucas is referring to. The story can be about anything, but it must have some kind of emotional importance to you. It can be a funny story, a serious story, dramatic, sad, whatever, doesn't matter. But in your initial post, you're going to share that story with us. Of course, make sure you are comfortable sharing this story. Don't share something with us that you're not comfortable sharing with the group. So that is your call, whatever you want to tell us about. Write the story to the best of your ability. Of course, use good grammar, good sentence structure, and keep it around 250 words. Okay, once you have told the story or decided the story you want to tell us and then written it out, based on the bulleted snapshots that we just went over above, tell us which ones of those do you think might be relevant to your story, and explain why. Connect one or two of those to your story and explain why they are relevant to your story. Now, of course, you're encouraged to do further research on any of those points above. There's lots of research to be had on any of those things. So if you want to learn more about each one, certainly go do that, and then tell us a little bit about how they connect to your story. And then, like all discussions, the last part of the discussion, once you've made your initial post and you've connected your post to some of those storytelling snippets, is you're going to respond to at least 2 of your classmates' initial posts and discuss your thoughts on their story, give them some feedback on the emotional and historical connections that they made. And of course, the general discussion guidelines apply. Okay? So this might give you an opportunity to make a few visits back to the discussion board this week, because you're going to want to digest these storytelling snippets, do a little research on them, think about which of your personal stories you want to share with us from when you were younger, write it up, and then come back and comment on how these snippets apply to your story, and of course reply to a couple of your classmates. So this is why you have the whole week to work on it. You might need to come back and visit a few times to get all of the work done. Okay, other than that, once you've finished that for the week, you're pretty much done for the week. We are moving on to step 4, which is the first draft of your title sequence project. So be sure to read through that. Keep working on that in the background. Check the due dates on when this draft is due. Go over to assignments and check that out. All right, so have a good week working on the discussion board. I will see you one time this week. And if you need any help, you know where to find me. Email me, office hours, the usual. All right, you have a good week.